11. In a rudimentary jacket minus one sleeve, Luzhin, who was being renovated, stood in profile before a cheval glass where a bald-headed tailor either chalked his shoulder and back or else jabbed pins into him, which he took with astonishing deftness from his mouth, where they seemed to grow naturally. From all the samples of cloth arranged neatly according to color in an album, Luzhin had chosen a dark gray square, and his fiancée spent a long time felling the corresponding bolt of cloth, where the tailor threw with a hollow thud onto the counter, unwrapped with lightning speed and pressed against his protruding stomach as if covering up his nakedness. She found that the material tended to crease easily, whereupon an avalanche of tight rolls of cloth began to cover up the counter, and the tailor, wetting his finger on his lower lip, unrolled and unrolled. Finally, a cloth was chosen that was also dark gray, but soft and flexible, and even a bit shaggy. And now Luzhin distributed about the cheval glass in pieces and sections, as if for a visual instruction. Here we have a plump, clean-shaven face. Here is the same face in profile, and here we have something rarely seen by the subject himself. The back of his head, fairly closely cropped, with folds on the neck and slightly protruding ears, pink where the light shines through, looked at himself and at the material, failing to recognize its former smooth, generous, virgin integrity. "I think it needs to be a bit narrower in the front," said his fiancée, and the tailor, taking a step backward, slid his eyes at Luzhin's figure, purred in the polite trace of a smile that the gentleman was somewhat on the stout side, and then busied himself with some newborn lapels, pulling this and putting that, while Luzhin, in the meantime, with a gesture peculiar to all the people in his position, held his arm slightly away from his body, or else bent it at the elbow and looked at his wrist, trying to get accustomed to the sleeve. In passing, the tailor slashed over him the heart with chalk to indicate a small pocket, then pitilessly ripped off the sleeve that seemed finished, and began quickly to remove the pins from Luzhin's stomach. Besides a good business suit, they made Luzhin a dress suit. The old-fashioned tuxedo found at the bottom of his trunk was altered by the same tailor. His fiancée did not dare to ask why Luzhin had formerly needed a tuxedo and an opera hat, fearing to arouse chaste memories, and therefore she never learned about a certain big dinner given in Birmingham, where, incidentally, Valentinov, oh well, good luck to him. The renovation of Luzhin's envelope did not stop here. Shirts, ties, and socks appeared, and Luzhin accepted all this with carefree interest. For the sanatorium, he moved into a small, gaily papered room that had been rented on the second floor of his fiancée's building, and when he moved in he had exactly the same feeling as in childhood when he was moved from country to town. It was always strange, this settling into town. You went to bed and everything was so new. In the silence of the night, the wooden pavement would come to life for several seconds of slow clip-clop. The windows were curtained more heavily and more sumptuously than at the manor. In darkness slightly relieved by the bright line of the incompletely closed door, the objects stopped expectantly, still not fully warmed up, and still having not completely renewed their acquaintanceship after the long summer interval. And when you woke up, there was sober, gray light outside the windows, and the sun slipped through a milky haze in the sky, looking like the moon, and suddenly in the distance a burst of military music. It approached in orange waves, was interrupted by the hurried beat of a drum, and soon everything died down, and in place of the puffed-out sounds of trumpets, there came again the imperturbable clopping of hooves and the subdued rattling of the St. Petersburg morning. "You forget to put out the light in the corridor," said, smiling, his landlady, an elderly German woman. "You forget to close your door at night," and she also complained to his fiancé, saying he was absent-minded like an old professor. "Are you comfortable, Luzhin?" His fiancée kept inquiring. "Are you sleeping well, Luzhin?" "No, I know it's not comfortable, but it will all change soon." "There's no need to put it off any longer," muttered Luzhin, putting his arms around her and interlacing his fingers on her hip. Sit down, there's no need to put it off. Let's do it tomorrow. Most lawful matrimony." "Yes, soon," she replied, "but it can't be done in a single day. There's still one more establishment. There you and I will hang on the wall for 2 weeks, and in the meantime your wife will come from Palermo, take a look at the names, and say, 'Impossible, Luzhin's mine.'" "It's mislaid," replied her mother when she inquired about her birth certificate. "I put it away and mislaid it. I don't know anything." The document, however, was found pretty quickly, and in any case it was too late now to warn, to forbid, to think up difficulties. The wedding rolled up with fatal smoothness, could not be stopped as if one were standing on ice, slippery, nothing to catch hold of. She was forced to submit and think up ways of embellishing and displaying her daughter's fiancé, so as not to be ashamed before other people, and she had to pluck up the courage to smile at the wedding, to play the role of the satisfied mother, and to praise Luzhin's honesty and goodness of heart. She also thought of how much money he had gone to Luzhin, how much more was still to go, and she tried to expel a terrifying picture from her imagination. Luzhin, disrobed, aflame with simian passion, and her stubbornly submissive, cold daughter. Meanwhile, the frame for this picture was also ready. A not very expensive but decently furnished apartment was rented in the vicinity, on the 5th floor, it is true, but that did not matter. There was an elevator for Luzhin's shortness of breath, and in any case the stairs were not steep, and there was a chair on every landing beneath a stained-glass window. From the spacious entrance hall, conveniently enlivened by the silhouette drawings in black frames, a door to the left opened onto the bedroom, and a door to the right into the study. Farther down the right-hand side of the entrance hall was the door to the drawing room. The adjoining dining room had been made a little longer at the expense of the entrance hall, which at this point neatly turned into a corridor, a transformation chastely concealed by a plush portiere on rings. To the left of the corridor was the bathroom, then the servants' room at the end, and the kitchen. The future mistress of the apartment liked the disposition of the rooms. Their furniture was less to her taste. The study stood some brown velvet armchairs, a bookcase crowned with a broad-shouldered, sharp-faced Dante in a bathing cap, and a large empty desk with an unknown past and an unknown future. A rickety lamp on a black spiraled standard, sought with an orange shade, rose behind a small couch on which someone had forgotten a light-haired teddy bear and a fat-faced toy dog with broad pink soles and a black spot over one eye. Above the couch hung the imitation Gobelin tapestry, depicting some dancing rustics. From the study, if the sliding doors were given a slight push, a thorough view opened up, the parquet floor of the drawing room, and beyond it the dining room with its sideboard reduced by perspective. In the drawing room, a palm gave off a glazed green light, and little rugs were strewn about the floor. Finally, there came the dining room with the sideboard, now grown to its natural size and with plates around the walls. Above the table, a lone, fluffy little toy devil was hanging from the low lamp. There was a bay window, and from there one could see a small public garden with a fountain at the end of the street. Returning to the dining room table, she looked through the drawing room into the distant study at the Gobelin, now in turn reduced, and then went into the dining room, into the corridor, and passed through the entrance hall into the bedroom. There, pressing close up to one another, stood two flocculent beds. The lamp turned out to be in the Mauritanian style. The curtains over the windows were yellow, promising a deceptive sunlight in the mornings, and a woodcut in the wall space between the windows showed a child prodigy in a nightgown that reached to his heels playing on an enormous piano, while his father, wearing a gray dressing gown and carrying a candle, stood stock-still with the door ajar. Something had to be added and something taken away. A portrait of the landlady's grandfather was removed from the drawing room, and the study was hastily cleared of an oriental-looking small table inlaid with mother-of-pearl chessboard. The bathroom window, whose lower part was a sparkly blue frosted glass, turned out to be cracked at its upper, transparent part, and a new pane had to be put in. In the kitchen and servants' room, the ceilings were whitewashed anew. A photograph grew up in the shade of the drawing-room palm tree. But generally speaking, as she inspected and arranged this apartment, rented with a long view but a short notice, as her father joked, she could not throw off the thought that all this was only temporary. Yet no doubt it would be necessary to take Luzhin away from Berlin to amuse him with other countries. Any future is unknown, but sometimes it acquires a particular fogginess, as if some other force had come to aid of destiny's natural reticence, and disturbed this resilient fog from which thought rebounds. But how gentle and sweet Luzhin was these days! How cosily he sat at the tea-table in his new suit, adorned by a smoke-colored tie, and politely, if not always in the right places, agreed with his interlocutor. His future mother-in-law told her acquaintances that Luzhin had decided to abandon chess because it took up too much of his time, but that he did not like to talk about it, and now Oleg Sergeyevich Smirnovsky no longer asked for a game, but disclosed to him with a gleam in his eye the secret machinations of the Masons, and even promised to give him a remarkable pamphlet to read. In the establishments they visited to inform officials of their intention to enter into matrimony, Luzhin conducted himself like a grown-up, carried all the documents himself reverently and considerately, and lovingly filled in with the forms, distinctly tracing out each letter. His handwriting was small, round, and extraordinarily neat, and not a little time was expended in unscrewing his new fountain pen, which he somewhat affectedly shook to one side before beginning to write, and then he had thoroughly enjoyed the glide of the gold nib, thrust back into his breast pocket with its gleaming clip outside, and it was with pleasure that he accompanied his fiancée around the stores and waited for the interesting surprise of the apartment which she had decided to show him until after their wedding. During the 2 weeks that their names were hung up on the view, various wide-awake firms began to send them offers, sometimes to the future groom and sometimes to the future bride, vehicles for weddings and funerals with a picture of carriage, harnessed to a pair of galloping horses, dress suits for hire, top hats, furniture, wine, halls to rent, and pharmaceutical appurtenances. Luzhin conscientiously examined the illustrated catalogues and stored them in his room, at a loss to know why his fiancée was so scornful of these all-interesting offers. There were also offers of another kind. There was what Luzhin called a small party with his future father-in-law, a pleasant conversation in the course of the latter offered to get him a job in a commercial enterprise later on, of course, Not immediately, then let them live in peace for a few months. Life, my friend, is so arranged, it was said in this conversation, that every second costs a man, at the very minimum estimate, 1/4 or 2 of a fitting, and that would be a beggar's life, but you have to support a wife who is used to a certain amount of luxury. Yes, yes, said Luzhin, with a beaming smile, trying to disentangle in his mind a complex computation that his interlocutor had just made with such delicate deftness. For this you need a little more money, the latter continued, and Luzhin held his breath in expectation of a new trick. A second will cost you dearer. I repeat, I am prepared at first, the first year, let's say, to give you generous assistance, but with time. Look, come see me at some time at the office. I'll show you some interesting things. Thus, in the most pleasant manner possible, people and things around him tried to adorn the emptiness of Luzhin's life. He allowed himself to be lulled, spoiled, and titillated, but with his soul rolled up in a ball, he accepted the caress of life that enveloped him from all sides. The future appeared to him vaguely as a long silent embrace in a blissful penumbra, through which the diverse playthings of his world of ours would pass by, entering a ray of light and then disappearing again, laughing and swaying as they went, but unavoidable moments of solitude during his engagement, and late at night, very early in the morning, there would be a sensation of strange emptiness, as if the colorful jigsaw puzzle down on the tablecloth had proved a certain curiously shaped blank spots, and once he dreamt he saw Taradi sitting with his back to him. Taradi was deep in thought, leaning in one arm, but from behind his broad back, as if it was impossible to see, he was bending over and pondering. Luzhin did not want to see what it was, and was afraid to see, but nonetheless he cautiously began to look over his black shoulder, and then he saw that a bowl of soup stood before Taradi, and that he was not leaning on his arm, but merely tucking a napkin into his collar, and that on November day, with this dream preceded, Luzhin was married. Oleg Sergeyevich Smirnovsky, a certain Baltic baron, were witness when Luzhin and his bride were led into a large room and seated at a long cloth-covered table. An official changed his jacket and worn frock coat and read the marriage sentence. At this everyone stood up, after which the professional smile and a human handshake, and the official paid his respects to the newlyweds, and everything was over. A fat janitor by the door bowed to them in expectation of a tip, and Luzhin good-naturedly proffered his hand, which the other received upon his palm, not realizing at first that this was a human hand and not a handout. That same day there was also a church wedding. The last time Luzhin had been in a church was many years ago at his mother's funeral. Peering further into the depths of the past, he remembered nocturnal returns of the catkin night, holding a candle whose flame darted about in his hands, maddened at being carried out of the warm church into the unknown darkness, and finally died of a heart attack at the corner of the street, where a gust of wind bore down from the Neva. There had been confession at the chapel on Pochmadskaya Street. The footfalls had a special way of resounding in its twilight emptiness, and the chairs moved with the sounds of throats being cleared, and the waiting people sat one behind the other, and from time to time a whisper would burst out from the mysteriously curtained corner. And he remembered the lights at Easter. The deacon would read in sobbing bass voice, but still sobbing would close the enormous gospel with a sweeping gesture, and he remembered how airy and penetrating, so it evoked a sucking sensation in the epicaster, the Greek word Pascha, Pascal's cake, sounded on an empty stomach when it pronounced by the emaciated priest. He would remembered how difficult it always was to catch the moment when the smoothly swaying censer was aimed at you, precisely at you, and not at your neighbor, and to bow so that the bow came exactly at the thurible swing. There was a smell of incense in the hot fall of the drop of wax from the knuckles of one's hand, and the dark honey-hued luster of the icon awaiting one's kiss, languorous recollections dusking the spitful gleams of porous church air, and pins and needles in the leg, and to all this now was added a veiled bride, a crown that trembled in the air over his very head and looked as if it might fall at any minute. He squinted up at it cautiously, and it seemed to him that once or twice the invisible hand of someone holding the crown passed it to another, also invisible hand. Yes, yes, replied hastily to the priest's question, and wanted to add how nice everything was, and strange, and how heart-melting, but he only cleared his throat agitatedly, and the rays of light wheeled brilliantly in his eyes, and afterwards, when everyone was sitting at the big table, he had the same feeling you get when you come home after matins to the festive table, with its gilt-horned ram of butter, ham, a virgin smooth pyramid of Pascal cottage cheese that you want to start on right away, bypassing the ham and eggs. It was hot and noisy, and lots of people were sitting at a table who must have been in church at well. Never mind, let them stay a while for the time being. Miss Luzhin looked at her husband, at his curl in his beautifully tailored dress suit, and crooked half-smile with which he greeted the horses. Her mother, liberally powdered and wearing a very low dress that showed in the old days the tight groove between their raised 18th century breasts, was bearing up heroically, and even used the familiar second-person singular "si" to her young son-in-law, so that at first Luzhin did not realize to whom she was speaking. He drank 2 glasses of champagne, and all that pleasant drowsiness began to come over him in waves. They went out into the street. The black windy night struck him softly on the breast, which was unprotected by its underdeveloped red dress waistcoat, and his wife requested him to to button up his overcoat. Her father, who had been smiling the whole evening and silently raising his glass in some special way until it was level with his eyes, a mannerism he had adopted from a certain diplomat who used to say "skull" very elegantly, now raised a bunch of door keys glinting in the lamplight as a mark of farewell, still smiling, and his eyes alone. Her mother, with an ermine wrap on her shoulders, tried not to look at Luzhin's back as he climbed into the taxicab. The guests, all a little drunk, took leave of their hosts and one another, and laughing discreetly surrounded the car, which finally moved off. And then someone yelled "Hurrah!" And a late passerby, turning to his woman companion, remarked approvingly, "Shimalatsky Shimayat, fellow countrymen celebrating." Luzhin immediately fell asleep in the cab. Reflected gleams of whitish light unfolded fantom-wise, bringing his face to life. The soft shadow made by his nose circled slowly over his cheek and then his lip, and again it was dark until another light went by, stroking Luzhin's hand in passing, which appeared to slide into a dark pocket as soon as the darkness returned. And then came a series of bright lights, and one flushed out a shadowy butterfly from behind his white tie, and then his wife carefully adjusted his muffler, since the cold November night penetrated even to the closed automobile. He woke up and screwed up his eyes, not realizing immediately where he was, but at that moment the taxi came to a halt, and his wife said softly, "Luzhin, we're home." In the elevator he stood smiling and blinking, somewhat dazed but not in the least drunk, and looked at the row of buttons, one of which his wife pressed. "Quite a way up," he said, and looked at the elevator ceiling, as if expecting to see the summit of their journey. The elevator stopped. "Hic," said Luzhin, and dissolved into quiet laughter. They were met in the entrance hall by the new servant, a plumpish wench, who immediately held out her red, disproportionately large hand to them. "Oh, why did you wait for us?" said his wife. Speaking rapidly, the maid congratulated them and reverently took up Luzhin's opera hat. Luzhin, with a subtle smile, showed her how it banged flat. "Amazing!" exclaimed the maid. "You can go to bed," repeated his wife anxiously. "We'll walk up." The lights went on in turn in the study, drawing room, and the dining room. "Extends like a telescope," mumbled Luzhin sleepily. He did not look at anything properly. He could not keep his eyes open enough. He was already on his way to the dining room when he noticed he was carrying in his arms a large plush dog with pink soles. He put it on the table, and a fluffy imp hanging from the lamp immediately came down like a spider. The rooms went dark, and the sections of a telescope being folded together, and Luzhin found himself in the bright corridor. "Go to bed," again shouted his wife to someone who at the far end rustled and bid them good night. "That's the servants' room," said his wife, "and the bathroom's here to the left." "What's the little place?" whispered Luzhin. "In the bathroom. Everything's in the bathroom," she replied, and Luzhin cautiously opened the door, and when he had convinced himself of something, he speedily locked himself in. His wife passed through the hallway into the bedroom, and sat down in an armchair, looking at the entrancingly flocculent beds. "Oh, I'm tired," she smiled, and for a long time watched a big sluggish fly that circled around the Mauritania lamp, buzzing hopelessly, then disappeared. This way," she cried, hearing Luzhin's uncertain shuffling steps in the hallway. "Bedroom," he said approvingly, and placing his hands behind his back, he looked about him for a while. She opened the wardrobe where she had put away their things the day before, hesitating, turned to her husband. "I'll take a bath," she said. "All your things are in here." "Wait a minute," said Luzhin, and suddenly yawned with his mouth wide open. "Wait a minute," he repeated in a palatial voice, gulping down between the syllables the elastic pieces of yawn. But picking up their pajamas and bedroom slippers, she quickly left the room. The water poured from the tap in thick blue stream and began to fill the white bathtub, steaming tenderly and changing the tone of the murmur to the rebel rose. Looking at its gushing gleam, she reflected with some anxiety that the limits of her feminine competency were now in sight, and that there was one sphere in which it was not her place to lead. As she immersed herself in the bath, she watched the tiny water bubbles gathering on her skin and on the sinking porous sponge, settling down up to the neck. She saw herself through the already slightly soapy water, her body thin and almost transparent, and when it came just barely out of the water, this sound, glistening, pink island, was somehow unexpected in its unmistakable corporeality. "After all, it is none of my affair," she said, freeing one sparkling arm from the water and pushing the hair back from her forehead. She turned on the hot water again, reveling in the resonant waves of warmth as they passed over her stomach, and finally causing a small storm in the bathtub, she stepped out and unhurriedly began to dry herself. "Turkish beauty," she said, standing only in her silk pajama pants before the slightly sweating mirror. "Pretty well built on the whole," she said after a while. Continuing to look at herself in the mirror, she began slowly to draw on her pajama top. "A bit full in the hips," she said. The water in the bath had been flowing out with a gurgle and suddenly squeaked, and all was quiet. The bathtub was now empty, and only the plug hole retained a tiny soapy whirlpool. Suddenly she realized she was dawdling on purpose, standing in her pajamas before the mirror, and a shiver went through her breast. It was when you were leafing through last year's magazine, knowing that in just a second, the door will open and the dentist will appear on the threshold. Whistling loudly, she walked into the bedroom, and the whistle was immediately cut short. Luzhin, covered to the waist by an eiderdown, his starched shirt front undone and bulging, was lying on the bed with his hands tucked under his head and emitting a purring snore. His collar hung on the foot of the bed, his trousers sprawled on the floor, their suspenders spread out, and his dress coat, set crookedly on the shoulders of a hanger, was lying on the couch with one tail tucked under it. All this she quietly picked up and put away. Before going to the bed, she moved back the window curtain to see if the blind had been lowered. It had not been. In the dark depths of the courtyard, the night wind rocked a shrub, and the faint light shed from somewhere unknown something glistened, perhaps a puddle on the stone path that skirted the lawn, and in another place the shadow of some railings fitfully appeared and disappeared, and suddenly everything went dark, and there was only a black chasm. She thought she would fall asleep as soon as she jumped into bed, but it turned out otherwise. The cooing snore beside her and the strange melancholy in this dark, unfamiliar room kept her suspended and would not allow her to slip off into sleep. And for some reason the word match kept floating through her brain. A good match. Find yourself a good match. Match. An unfinished, interrupted match. Such a good game. Give Maestro my anxiety. Anxiety. She could have made a brilliant match, said her mother clearly, floating past in the darkness. Let's drink a toast, whispered a tender voice, and her father's eyes appeared round the edge of a glass, and the foam rose higher, and the new shoes pinched a bit, and it was so hot in the church. "12. The long trip abroad was postponed until spring. The sole concession Miss Luzhin made to her parents, who wanted, at least for the first few months, to be near at hand. Miss Luzhin herself somewhat feared Berlin life for her husband, entwined as it was with chess memories. It turned out, however, not to be difficult to amuse Luzhin even in Berlin. A long trip abroad, conversations about it, travel projects. In the study which Luzhin had become very fond of, there found a splendid atlas in one of the bookcases. The world was shown at first a solid sphere tightly bound in a net of longitudes and latitudes. Then it was rolled out flat, cut into halves, and served up in sections. When it was rolled out some place like Greenland, which at first had been a small process, a mere appendix, suddenly swelled out almost to the dimensions of the nearest continent. There were white bald patches on the poles. The ocean stretched out smoothly azure. Even on this map there would be enough water to say wash your hands. What then was it actually? So much water, deep, depth, breadth. Luzhin showed his wife all the shapes he had loved as a child, the Baltic Sea like a kneeling woman, the jackboot of Italy, the drop of Ceylon falling from India's nose. He thought if the equator was unlucky. Its path lay mostly across oceans. It cut across 2 continents, true, but it had no luck with Asia, which pulled up out of the way. Moreover, it pressed down and squashed what it did manage to cross. The tips are 2 things and became untidied islands. Luzhin knew the highest mountain and the smallest state, and looking at the relative positions of the 2 Americas, he found something acrobatic in their association, but in general all this could have been arranged more piquantly, he said, pointing to the map of the world. There is no idea behind it, no point, and he even grew a little angry that he was able to find the meaning in all these complicated outlines, and he spent hours looking as he had looked in childhood for a way going from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, a long labyrinth of rivers, or tracing some kind of rational pattern in the disposition of mountain ranges. Now where shall we go? Said his wife, and clucked slightly, the way adults do to indicate pleasant anticipation when they begin to play with children. And then she loudly named the romantic spots. First down here to the Riviera, she suggested, Monte Carlo, Nice, or say the Alps. And then this way a bit, said Luzhin. They have very cheap grapes in the Crimea. What are you saying, Luzhin? The Lord have mercy on you. It's impossible for us to go to Russia. Why? Said Luzhin. They invited me to go. Nonsense. Stop it, please, she said, angered not so much by Luzhin's talking of impossible as by his referring obliquely to something connected with chess. Look down here, she said, and Luzhin obediently transferred his gaze to another place on the map. Here, for instance, is Egypt, the pyramids, and here is Spain, which they do horrible things to bulls. Knowing that Luzhin had probably already been more than once in many of these towns and they might have visited, she did not name the large cities in order to avoid any harmful reminiscence, a superfluous caution. The world in which Luzhin had traveled in this time was not depicted on the map, and if she had named him Rome or London, then from the sound of these names on her lips and from the big note on the map, he would have imagined something completely new, never seen before, and not in any circumstance the vague chess cafe, which was always the same whether situated in Rome or London, or even in the innocent Nice, so trustfully named by her. And when she brought the innumerable folders back from the railroad office, the world of chess-playing trips separated, as it were, more sharply from this new world, where the tourist strolled in his white suit and a pair of binoculars on a strap. There were black palms silhouetted against a rosy sunset, and the reversed silhouettes of the same palms of the rosy Nile. There was almost indecently blue gulf and a sugary white hotel with a multicolored flag waving in the opposite direction to take smoke of a steamer on the horizon. There were snowy mountain tops and suspension bridges and lagoons with gondolas and an infinite number of ancient churches and a narrow cobbled lane and a small donkey with two thick pails on its sides. Everything was attractive, everything was entertaining, everything set the unknown author on the brochures into transports of praise. The musical names, the millions of saints, the waters that cured all sicknesses, the age of her town rampart, hotels of the first, second, third class, all this rippled before the eyes, and everything was fine. Luzhin was awaited everywhere. They called him in voices of thunder. They were driven wild by their own hospitality, and without asking the owner, they distributed the sun. It was during these first days of married life that Luzhin visited his father-in-law's office. His father-in-law was dictating something, but the typewriter stuck to its own version, repeating the word "tot" in a rapid chatter with something like the following intonation: "Tot Hottentot, tot, 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 do tot, totter," and then nothing would move across with a bang. His father-in-law showed him sheafs of forms, account books with Z-shaped lines on the pages, books with little windows in their spines, and monstrously thick tomes of commercial Germany with a calculating machine, very clever and quite tame. However, Luzhin liked tot-tot best of all, the words spilling swiftly out into the paper, the wonderful evenness of the lilac lines in several copies at the same time. "I wonder if I, too, one needs to know," he said, and his father-in-law nodded approvingly, and the typewriter appeared in Luzhin's study. It was proposed to him that one of the office employees come and explain how to use it, but he refused, replying that he would learn on his own, and so it was. He fairly quickly made out its construction, learned to put in the ribbon and roll in the sheet of paper, and made friends with all the little levers. It proved to be more difficult to remember the distribution of the letters. The typing went very slowly, for it was one of the tot-tot's rapid chatter, and for some reason, from the very first day, the exclamation mark dogged him. It leapt out in the most unexpected places. At first he copied out half a column from a German newspaper, then composed a thing or two himself. A brief little note took shape with the following contents: "You are wanted on charge of murder. Today is November 27th. Murder and arson. Good day, mere madame. Now when you are needed, dear exclamation mark. Where are you? The body has been found. Dear madame, today the police will come." Luzhin read this over several times, reinserted the sheet, and groping for the right letters, typed out somewhat jumpily the signature Abbe Busoni. At this point he grew bored. The thing was going too slowly, and somehow he had to find use for the letter he had written. Burrowing in the telephone directory, he found a Frau Louisa Altmann, who wrote out the address by hand and sent her his composition. The photograph also provided him with certain amount of entertainment. Its chocolate-colored cabinet under the palm tree used to sing with a velvety voice, and Luzhin, one arm around his wife, would sit on the sofa and listen and think it would soon be night. She would get up and change the record, holding up the disc to the light, and one sector it would be a silky shimmer like moonlight on the sea, and again the cabinet would exude music, and again his wife would sit next to him and lower her chin onto interlaced fingers and listen, blinking. Luzhin remembered the airs and even attempted to sing them. There were moaning, chattering, and ululating dances, and a most tender American who sang in a whisper, and there was a whole opera of 15 records, Boris Godunov, with church bells ringing in one place, with sinister pauses. His wife's parents used to drop in frequently, and it was established that the Luzhins would dine with them 3 times a week. The mother tried several times to learn from her daughter a detail or two about their marriage, and would ask inquisitively, "Are you pregnant? Are you sure you're going to have a baby soon?" "Nonsense," replied the daughter. "I've just had twins." She was still her usual calm self, still smiled the same way with her brows lowered, and still addressed Luzhin by his surname, and the second person plural. "My poor Luzhin," she would say, tenderly pursing her lips. "My poor, poor man," and Luzhin would rub his cheek on her shoulder, and she would think vaguely that there were probably greater joys than the joys of compassion, but that these were no concerns of hers. Her only care in life was a minute-by-minute effort to arouse Luzhin's curiosity about things in order to keep his head above the dark water, so that he would breathe easily. She asked Luzhin in the mornings what he had dreamed, enlivened his matutinal appetite with a cutlet or English marmalade, took him for walks, lingered with him before shop windows, read War and Peace aloud to him after dinner, played jolly geography with him, and dictated sentences for him to type. Several times she took him to the museum and showed him her favorite pictures, and explained that in Flanders, where they had rain and fog, the painters used bright colors, while it was Spain, a country of sunshine, the gloomiest master of all had been born. She also said that over there she had a feeling for glass objects, and this one liked lilies and tender faces slightly inflamed by colds caught in heaven. And she directed his attention to 2 dogs domestically looking for crumbs beneath the narrow, poorly spread table of the Last Supper. Luzhin nodded and slid his eyes conscientiously, and there was a very long time examining an enormous canvas on which the artist had depicted all the torments of sinners in hell, a great detail, very curiously. They also visited the theater and the zoo and the movies, at which point it turned out that Luzhin had never been to the movies before. The picture ran on in a white glow, and finally, after many adventures, the girl returned, now a famous actress, to her parents' house, and paused in the doorway, while in the room, not seeing her yet, he grizzled father was playing chess with the doctor, a faithful friend of the family, who had remained completely unchanged over the years. In the darkness came the sound of Luzhin laughing abruptly. An absolutely impossible position for the pieces, he said, but at this point, to his wife's relief, everything changed, and his father, growing his eyes, walked toward the spectators and acted his part for all he was worth. His eyes widened. Then came a slight trembling. His lashes flapped. There was another bit of trembling, and slowly his wrinkles softened, grew kinder, and a slow smile of infinite tenderness appeared on his face, which continued to tremble. And yet, gentlemen, the old man cursed his daughter at his time. But the doctor stood to one side. He remembered the poor humble doctor, how as a young girl at the very beginning of the picture she had thrown flowers over the fence at him, while he, lying on the grass, had been reading a book. He had then raised his head and had seen only a fence, but suddenly a girl's head, with parted hair, rose on the other side, and then came a pair of eyes glowing even bigger. Ah, what mischievousness! What playfulness! Go on, doctor, jump over the fence. There she runs, the sweet nymph. She's hiding around those trees. Catch her, doctor. But now all this is gone. Head bowed, hands limply hanging, one of them holding a hat, stands a famous actress, a fallen woman, alas, and the father, continuing the trembling, slowly opens his arms, and suddenly she kneels before him. Luzhin began to blow his nose. When they left the movie house, he had red eyes, and he cleared his throat and denied that he had even been crying. And the following day, over morning coffee, he leaned an elbow over the table and said thoughtfully, "Very, very good, that picture." He thought a bit more and added, "But they don't know how to play." "What do you mean, they don't know?" said his wife with surprise. "They were first-class actors." Luzhin looked at her sideways and immediately averted his eyes, and there was something about this she did not like. Suddenly she realized what was up and began to debate with herself how to make Luzhin forget this unfortunate game of chess, which that fool of a director had seen fit to introduce for the sake of atmosphere. But Luzhin evidently immediately forgot it himself. He was engrossed in some genuine Russian bread that his mother-in-law had sent, and his eyes were again quite clear. In this way a month passed, a second. The winter that year was white, St. Petersburg one. Luzhin was made a wadded overcoat. Indigent refugee Russians were given certain of Luzhin's old things, including a green woolen scarf of Swiss origin. Mothballs exuded a rough-edged, melancholy smell. In the entrance hall hung a condemned jacket. "It's so comfortable," implored Luzhin, "so very comfortable." "Leave it alone," said his wife from the bedroom. "I haven't looked at it yet. It's probably teeming with moths." Luzhin took off the dinner jacket he had been trying on to see whether he filled out much during the past month. He had filled out, and tomorrow there would be a big Russian ball, a charitable affair, and slipped lovingly into the sleeves of the condemned one. A darling jacket, not the slightest trace of a moth in it. He was just a tiny hole in the pocket, but not right through, like they sometimes were. "Wonderful!" he cried in a high voice. His wife, sock in hand, looked out from the entrance hall. "Take it off, Luzhin. It's torn and dusty. Goodness knows how long it's lain about." "No, no," said Luzhin. She inspected it from all sides. Luzhin stood and slapped himself on the hips and felt incidentally as if there were something in his pocket. He thrust his hand in. "Oh, no, nothing. Only a hole." "It's very decrepit," said his wife, frowning, "but perhaps as a work tote." "I beg you," said Luzhin. "Well, as you wish. Only give it to the maid afterwards, to see if she can give it a good beating." "No, it's clean," said Luzhin to himself, and resolved to hang it somewhere in his study, to some little nook, to take it off and hang it up the way civil servants do. In taking it off, he again felt as if his jacket were a trifle heavier on the left side, but he remembered that the pockets were empty and did not investigate the cause of the heaviness. As to the dinner jacket here, it had become tightish. Yes, definitely tightish. "A ball," said Luzhin, and imagined himself lots and lots of circling couples. The ball turned out to be taking place in one of the best hotels in Berlin. There was a crush near the cloakrooms, and the attendants were accepting things and carrying them away like sleeping children. Luzhin was given a neat metal number. He missed his wife, but he found her immediately. She was standing in front of the mirror. He placed the metal disc against the tender hollow of her smooth, powdered back. "Brr, that's cold," she exclaimed, moving her shoulder blade. Arm in arm," said Luzhin. "We have to enter arm in arm," and that is how they entered. The first thing Luzhin saw was his mother-in-law, looking much younger, rosy red, and wearing a magnificent, sparkling headdress, a Russian woman's koshkushnik. She was selling punch, and an elderly Englishman, who had simply come down from his room, was quickly becoming drunk, and one elbow propped on her table. At another table near a fir tree, adorned with colored lights, there was a pile of lottery prizes, a dignified samovar with red and blue reflected lights on the tree side, dolls dressed in sarafans, a phonograph, and liqueurs donated by Smirnovsky. A third table had sandwiches, Italian salad, cauliflower, and a beautiful blonde lady was calling to someone, "Marya Vasilyevna, Marya Vasilyevna." Why did it take it away again? I had asked a very good evening to you, said somebody close by, and Miss Luzhin raised an arched, swan-like hand. Farther on, in the next room, there was music, and the dancers circled and marked time in the space between tables. Someone's back banged into Luzhin at full speed, and the grunted and stepped back. His wife had disappeared, and searching for her with his eyes, he had sat backed off into the first room. Here the tombola again attracted his attention, paying out a mark at every time. He would plunge his hand into the box and fish out a tiny cylinder of rolled-up paper. Snuffling through his nose and protruding his lips, he would take a long time to unroll the paper, and finding no number inside, would look to see if there was something on the outer side, a useless but very normal procedure. In the end, he won a children's book, Purry Cat or something, and not knowing what to do with it, left it on a table where 2 full glasses were awaiting the returning of a dancing couple. The crush and the movement of the bursts of music now got on his nerves, and there was nowhere to hide, and everyone probably was looking at him and wondering why he did not dance. In the intervals between the dances, his wife looked for him in the other room, but at every step she was stopped by acquaintances. A great many people attended this ball. There is a foreign consul, obtained with great difficulty, and a famous Russian singer, and 2 movie actresses. Somebody pointed out to their table the ladies wore artificial smiles, and their escorts, 3 well-fed men of the producer businessman type, kept clucking their tongues and snapping out fingers and abusing the pale sweating waiter for his slowness and inefficiency. One of these men seemed particularly obnoxious to her. He had very white teeth and shining brown eyes. Having dealt with the waiter, he began to relate something in a loud voice, sprinkling his Russian with the most hackneyed German expressions. All at once she felt depressed that everyone was looking at these movie people and the singer at the console, and nobody seemed to know that a chess genius was present at the ball, a man whose name had been in millions of newspapers and whose games had already been called immortal. You are amazingly easy to dance with. They have a good floor here. Excuse me, it's terribly crowded. The receipts will be excellent. This man over here is from the French embassy. It is amazingly easy to dance with you. With this kind of conversation usually ended. They liked to dance with her, but they did not know exactly what to talk about. A rather pretty but boring young lady, and that strange marriage to an unsuccessful musician or something of that sort. What did you say? A former socialist? A what? A player? A card player? Do you ever visit them, Oleg Sergeyevich? In the meantime, Luzhin had found a deep armchair not far from the staircase and was looking at the crowd from behind a column and smoking his 13th cigarette into another armchair next to him. After making a preliminary inquiry as to whether it was taken or not, settled a swarthy gentleman with a tiny mustache. People still continued to go by, and Luzhin gradually became frightened. There was nowhere he could look without meeting inquisitive eyes, and from the accursed necessity of looking somewhere else, he fixed on the mustache of the neighbor, who evidently was also staggered and perplexed by all this noisy, unnecessary commotion. This person, feeling Luzhin's gaze on him, turned his face to him. "It's a long time since I was at a ball," he said amiably and grinned, shaking his head. "The main thing is not to look," uttered Luzhin hollowly, using his hand as a form of blinkers. "I've come a long way," explained the man. "A friend dragged me here. To tell the truth, I'm tired." "Tiredness and heaviness," nodded Luzhin. "Who knows what it all means? It surpasses my conception, particularly when you work as I do, on a Brazilian plantation," said the gentleman. "Plantation," repeated Luzhin after him like an echo. "You have an odd way of living here," continued the stranger. "The world is open on all 4 sides, and here they are pounding out Charlestons on an extremely restricted fragment of floor." "I'm also going away," said Luzhin. "I've got the travel folders." "There is nothing like freedom," exclaimed the stranger. "Free wanderings and a favorable wind, and what wonderful countries! I met a German botanist in the forest beyond Rio Negro, and lived with the wife of a French engineer on Madagascar." "I must get their folders too," said Luzhin. "Very attractive things, folders, everything in great detail." "Luzhin, so that's where you are!" suddenly cried his wife's voice, and she was passing quickly by on her father's arm. "I'll be back immediately. I'll just get a table for us," she cried, looking over her shoulder, and disappeared. "Is your name Luzhin?" asked the gentleman curiously. Yes, said Luzhin, "but it's of no importance." "I knew one, Luzhin," said the gentleman, screwing up his eyes, for memory is short-sighted. "I knew one. You didn't happen to go to the Balashevsky school, did you?" "Suppose I did," replied Luzhin, and seized by an unpleasant suspicion he began to examine his companion's face. "In that case we were classmates," exclaimed the other. "My name is Petrushev. Do you remember me?" "Oh, of course you remember. What a coincidence. I could never have recognized you by your face. Tell me, Luzhin, your first name and patronymic?" "Ah, I seem to remember. Tony Anton. What's next?" "You're mistaken, said Luzhin with a shudder. "Yes, my memory is bad," continued Petrushev. "I've forgotten lots of names. For instance, do you remember that quiet boy we had? Later he lost an arm fighting under the Wrangel, just before the evacuation. I saw him in church in Paris. What's his name now?" "Why is all this necessary?" said Luzhin. "Why talk about it so much?" "No, I don't remember," sighed Petrushev. tearing his palm from his forehead. But then, for instance, there was Gromov. He's also in Paris now, fixed himself up nicely, it seems. But where are the others? Where are they all? Dispersed, gone up in smoke. It's odd to think about it. Well, and how are you getting on, Luzhin? How are you getting on, old boy? All right, said Luzhin, and averted his eyes from the expense of Petrushev, seeing his face suddenly as it had been then. Small, pink, and unbearably mocking. Wonderful times they were, said Petrushev. Do you remember our geographer, Luzhin? How he used to fly like a hurricane into the classroom holding a map of the world? And that little old man, I've forgotten the name. Do you remember how he used to shake all over and say, "Get on with you, Shaw, you noodle"? Wonderful times. And how he used to whip down those stairs into the yard. You remember, and how it turned out at the school party that Arbuzov could play the piano? Do you remember how his experiments never used to come off, and how we thought up a rhyme for him? Buzov? Just don't react, Luzhin said quickly to himself. And all that's vanished, continued Petrushev. Here we are at the ball. Oh, by the way, I seem to remember you took up something, some occupation, when you left the school. What was it? Yes, of course. Chess. No, said Luzhin. Why on earth must you— Oh, excuse me, said Petrushev affably. Then I'm getting mixed up. Yes, that's how it is. The ball's in full swing, and we're sitting here talking about the past. You know, I've traveled the whole world. What women in Cuba? Or that time in the jungle, for instance. It's all lies, sounded a lazy voice from behind. He was never in any jungle whatsoever. Now why do you spoil everything? Drawled Petrushev, turning around to listen to him, continued a bald, lanky person, the owner of the lazy voice. He has been living in France since the Revolution and left Paris for the first time the day before yesterday. Luzhin, allow me to introduce you, began Petrushev with a laugh, but Luzhin hastily made off, tucking his head into his shoulders and moving strangely and quivering from the speed of his walk. Gone, said Petrushev in astonishment, and added thoughtfully, after all, it may be that I took him for somebody else. Stumbling into people and exclaiming in a tearful voice, "Pardon, pardon," and still stumbling into people and trying not to see their faces, Luzhin looked for his wife, and when he finally caught sight of her, seized her by the elbow from behind so that she started and turned around. But at first she was unable to say anything. He was puffing too much. "What's the matter?" she asked anxiously. Let's go, he muttered, still holding her by the elbow. "Calm down, please, Luzhin. That's not necessary," she said, nudging him slightly to one side so that the bystanders could not hear. "Why do you want to go?" "There's a man there," said Luzhin, breathing jerkily, "and such an unpleasant conversation." "Whom you knew before?" she asked quietly. Yes, nodded Luzhin. "Let's go, I beg you." Half closing his eyes so that Petrushev would not notice him, he pushed his way through to the vestibule, began to rummage in his pockets looking for his tag, found it at last after several enormous seconds of confusion and despair, and shuffled this way and that impatiently while the cloakroom attendant, like a somnambulist, looked for his things. He was the first to get dressed and the first to go out, and his wife swiftly followed him, pulling on her moleskin coat together as she went. Only in the car did Luzhin begin to breathe freely, and his expression of distracted sullenness gave way to a guilty half-smile. "Dear Luzhin met a nasty person," said his wife, stroking his hand. "A schoolfellow, a suspicious character," explained Luzhin. "But now, dear Luzhin's all right," whispered his wife, and kissed his soft hand. "Now everything's gone," said Luzhin. But this was not quite so. Something remained, a riddle, a splinter. At nights he began to meditate over why this meeting had made him so uneasy. Of course, there were all sorts of individual unpleasantness, the fact that Petrushev had once tormented him in school, and had now referred obliquely to a certain torn book about little Tony, and the fact that a whole world full of exotic temperaments, exotic temptations, had turned out to be a braggart's rigmarole, and it would no longer be possible in future to trust travel folders. But it was not the meeting itself that was frightening, but something else, this secret meeting that he had to divine. He began to think intensely at nights, the way Sherlock had been wont to do over cigar ash, and gradually it began to seem that the combination was even more complex than he had at first thought, that the meeting with Petrushev was only the continuation of something, and that it was necessary to look deeper, to return and replay all the moves of his life from his illness until the ball.